Getting to Gilead, from surveillance to control. I'll be speed running a little bit through some of the slides, so if you want to double-click on something in particular, just come and look for me afterward. The presentation is divided into two parts: brief history of financial surveillance, and then we move on to a case study, and our case study will be the world of Gilead in The Handmaid's Tale. So just to set up, as consumers, we have come to expect so little financial privacy. I do one search on Google, and suddenly I have 20 trackers on my back through ad networks and data brokers. There's really nowhere to hide. My bank knows every store I've ever purchased anything from on my credit card, and they sell that data to affiliates and to marketers. We have normalized information gluttony. We've come to accept that taking out a loan entitles the lender to the sum total of my financial history, my past employers, my current addresses. Even, for example, in the US, when you rent an apartment, the real estate agent could be any random person, could also get access to that kind of data. So we've really normalized this. So then I started to ask myself, like, when did we go from normal cash register, here's my money, take it, bye, see you never, to this crazy web of data? When and how did we become so promiscuous with our financial data? So I assumed it all happened in the last 20 years or so with the rise of the internet, and consumer apps. But when I started digging, I found out it started a long time ago. This is a magazine from 1953. And even then, a journalist remarked, personal credit ratings are kept by small bureaus, which are like branches of the FBI. Such news will make even the head of the Soviet police gnash his teeth in envy. And so, for example, these reports contain more intimate data than our credit reports contain today. They talk about your drinking habits. They gossip about how people are living beyond their means, whether people like them at work and in the community. So this was 1953. But the more digging I did, I realized, actually, it started a long, long time ago. So this is a newspaper article from 1873. And the subtitle reads, "Private Detectives Watching. Spies around the house and in the kitchen." So just for another example, these are some questions that these private detectives would ask your neighbors, your friends, your coworkers. Is he in debt? Does he drink? Does he keep a mistress? Does he go to brothels? So very, very invasive. This is 1873. So we kind of get an answer for when it might have all started, this change in financial privacy. The other question we asked is why? Why did this happen? And a heads up, this is quite a US-centric history, but the rest of the world was not far behind. So the end of the Civil War in the late 1800s left the US with better transport networks and a concentration of raw materials. It also led, unfortunately, to a shrunken labor pool, which increased the need for mechanization. And so all of these together sped up industrialization. But mass production requires mass consumption. And to have mass consumption, you need credit. What does credit need? Credit needs trust. And to trust somebody, you do need information on them, who they are like, what their moral character is like. This is one guy's financial and personal record from the late 1800s. So you can see how it talks about his relationship with his wife, what his estimated income is, etc., what his job history is like. And mass consumption also requires advertisements so that we know what we want to spend our money on. And this is an early washing machine and a broom. But I can't lend to you if I don't know you. Credit was fine when villages were small. Everybody knew everybody. But as cities grew and people started moving around, it became impossible to keep track of everybody. But no worries, somebody else can tell me about you. By the late 1890s, retailers started to share their blacklist of delinquent customers. And by the 1910s and 20s, more formal credit bureaus emerged. So this picture on the right is the Detroit Credit Bureau in 1927. And you can see rows of operators answering credit inquiries. And what these bureaus would do is they would hire private investigators to keep tabs on anyone they could keep tabs on. I can't, though, sell profitably to you if I don't know you. So what happened with the credit bureaus over time is they found an additional revenue stream. They would sell their data to retailers. So these retailers could upgrade from mass advertising. So not everybody wants to buy a gun. And as another example, if Mrs. Beckett, if you knew through her records at the department store that she bought high-end suits for her husband, maybe we should also show her some high-end fur coats. This is an ad from 1938. We don't have time to cover a lot of the other supporting technologies that supported the growth of surveillance, but here are some briefly. And I was very tickled to find this out. So apparently, vertical filing cabinets, they were a breakthrough. They were a symbol of modernity. It was the way businesses would scale into the far future. And this allowed credit bureaus to start collecting troves and troves of data and be able to collect the information, retrieve the information reasonably. It was such a breakthrough that just 2 years ago, there was an author that released a whole book on what an innovation the vertical filing cabinet was. There was another technology as well, the teletype, something like the telegraph, which essentially allowed transformation of credit report information from 5 minutes telling somebody verbally on the phone to just 1 minute. So when you're doing thousands of inquiries a day, this becomes really important. And obviously, computers. Computers very obviously allow more data to be collected. But an unexpected side effect was when computers first came out, they were very expensive. So the only credit bureaus who could invest in computers were the larger ones. And over time, they outcompeted the smaller ones. And so then over time, you had a lot of data that became aggregated in just a few players. So this effect of centralization was very major as well. Computers also started to allow credit bureaus to do statistical analysis, which became essentially the precursor to today's credit score, right? That one number you end up with. And everything we've talked about has been about commercial corporate surveillance. But thanks to the Cold War and 9/11, the government also started tapping into people's financial histories. So on the right-hand side, you have another credit bureau, and the FBI would sometimes have fixed desks at these credit bureaus. Super creepy. After 9/11, the Patriot Act also made it a lot easier for law enforcement to access bank and other records. So we talked about kind of the setup of surveillance, how it started, why it started. The next question is, how does surveillance lead to control? Because there is a gap between spying on people and restricting what they can do. For that, I turned to a case study. We're going to look at the Republic of Gilead in The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. Just by a show of hands, can you kind of, if you have some familiarity with the story, can you put your hands up? Okay, so it's about 30%. Okay, cool. Let's see. I highly recommend starting with the Hulu series. It's a really great introduction. And then for more details, the book is great too. So what is Gilead? Gilead is an evolution of a previously free United States. It's marked by a number of features. I'm going to go through them. So first, there is military control. There are guns and spies everywhere. There is financial control. All your accounts are controlled. There is meticulous accounting of who's buying what. There's also extreme religion. They hang people from different religions. They even hang people who, say, doctors who used to do abortions before the Republic of Gilead. And this has very eerie kind of analogies to to today. Not the hanging, but the kind of looking back at who's done these kind of processes. And famously, there is what I call coerced reproduction. Most people call it rape. Of these handmaids that the story is named after, it's marked by patriarchy. So even the women who helped create Gilead are relegated to powerless roles. And then finally, there is a strong amount of hierarchy. Everyone has a defined role. So on the women's side, you have the wives who are married to commanders. You have the Marthas, they're basically house servants. You have the handmaids. You have aunts who train handmaids. And then everybody else is in this category called unwomen. So like they're gay people, they're other subversives, they're all sent to labor camps, where most of them just die of starvation and disease. Among the men, you have commanders at the top. And then you have, just one step below, the angels, who are the officers. And then you have guardians, who are cops. You have eyes, who are spies. So it's a very hierarchical system. You don't really go between the levels. And commanders and wives, they would be assigned handmaids, who basically are nothing more than walking wombs. So how did it happen? The book was written in 1985. So how did a free US turn into Gilead? Technically, two things happened. First, there was a bloody coup. I was trying to figure out which picture to take, but fortunately, I have a current reference. And secondly, women's payment cards were frozen. So overnight, they couldn't pay for anything, much less plane tickets. And also, they were all simultaneously fired from their jobs. So I sat there wondering, like, why did this happen? Especially after Roe v. Wade was overturned in recent years. I got very curious about what led to the creation of Gilead. Charlie Munger once said, if you find out where you're going to die, you just never go there. So that was why I was curious. So I read and I reread the book. It seems like the major motivations were politics, religion, environmental degradation, kind of economic issues, demographic collapse. But what gave the people the ability to do what they did? It seemed like it was a mix of financial surveillance, digital payments, key one, the military and emergency powers, or the ability to implement emergency powers, as well as, obviously, control of the media. So since this talk is about financial surveillance, let's double-click into that. These are excerpts from the book. And they talk about how, say, for example, the protagonist was remembering the paper money when they still had that. It seemed so primitive. Have you tried getting anything on your card today? They've frozen them. Any account with an F on it instead of an M. All they needed to do is push a few buttons. We're cut off. And if there had still been portable money, it would have been a lot more difficult. So you start to get a sense of how Margaret has woven in the idea that being fully reliant on digital money is very, very dangerous. The military ability was critical too, so here are some relevant excerpts. I include them just because they sound so similar to what we've experienced in recent years. They shot the president, machine-gunned the Congress, and the army declared a state of emergency. They suspended the Constitution and said it would be temporary. Everyone approved of that in the name of security. I've been so vexed by this question of how Gilead could happen that I chased her down recently. So a week ago, I was in Greenland. Of all places, she decided to be in Greenland, so I chased her all the way there. And I sit down next to her at lunch. We chat about dictators. She tells me she studied them, and a lot of her books have elements of how a certain dystopia came to be. She starts telling me about NFTs. And then we start chatting about Gilead, and I show her the mind maps that I just had on the screen. She peers at them, and then she literally just waves them away. And she says, religion, politics, they're all at the surface. So she stares at me. Imagine a circle. At the top, you have dictatorship. At the bottom, you have chaos. In the middle, you have liberal democracy. And they have arrows going up and down between the levels. So essentially, it looks like that. But she said there's an extra arrow, like an escaped arrow, that goes from chaos to dictatorship, when people accept the rise of a strong man in a time of chaos, which, if you think about it, does make a lot of sense. There are clues throughout the book about this. Here's an excerpt talking about how food sources are gone, the fish farms have gone empty, and people stopped having... sorry, no, this is the wrong one, sorry. So this slide is about marches, riots, and bombings. And this slide shows some excerpts about how food sources are gone, fish farms have gone empty, and people stopped caring anymore. So what Margaret did say was, when a small, young population has to support a large, aging population, it just doesn't work. Financially, it doesn't work. Motivation, it doesn't work. And the really scary thing is this is happening right now to different severities and at different rates in different countries. So when she said that, it was very chilling to me. And she underscored, there are no revolutions in times of prosperity. So we have to ask ourselves how close we are to Gilead. I looked at the mind maps, and I thought I see kind of modern-day versions of all those issues that lead to dystopias like Gilead. But I think actually we're set up for worse than Gilead. We're too close for comfort. In the US, we've seen abortion bans. We're looking at potential contraception bans, and books are being removed from libraries, even books on physics. So I think it will be even worse because of the panopticon that follows us today and the scary world of hyper-competent AI tomorrow. Twitter for your bank account, the common refrain in the Zcash world, also doesn't help. And to drive that point home that it is worse today, wrong slide. Oh, I'm missing a slide, but basically what I wanted to show you was a headline from the New York Times about how North Korean defectors have plunged from about 1,000 a year to 64 a year. And the reason for that is they keep trying to escape while in China, but they always get caught by CCTVs. So, in many ways, I think this world is worse than the one that Margaret Atwood painted in 1985. And one last thing is, I think one really important theme from the book was how normalization becomes the enemy. So these are some quotes which show that within just a few years, women found having jobs such a strange idea, just a few years. And there's this scene where a bunch of Japanese tourists walk into town, and all these handmaids, they notice that these Japanese tourists have skirts that go past the knee. And their reaction was, they seem undressed. So I think normalization is an insidious, it follows an insidious path. And if you follow kind of it further, the younger girls born after the takeover, they aren't even going to know what to fight for anymore. Because, as you see here, they will have no memories of any other way. Which takes me back to the start of my presentation. I'm a child of the mid-'80s. I have very little memory of financial privacy. The TikTok generation will have no memory of any kind of privacy. So who is going to keep fighting when all of you retire? So to summarize, as consumers, we've come to expect so little privacy, financial privacy, but we must fight normalization because the future has not been written. question?
Hello? Okay. Yes, we don't have any questions from Huva, so if people in the room want to ask, yeah, please go ahead.
Yes, I had a question. What did Margaret Atwood say about NFTs?
It's a great question. I think she, like a lot of creatives, have felt exploited by a lot of these models who have absorbed their work. And so one way to reclaim some of that, at least for her, it sounds like she's launching kind of book sales where she would be entitled to secondary kind of royalties. So that was what she said about NFTs. Yes, somebody was trying to pitch the idea of AI writing to her as well. She thought the poetry she's seen has been terrible. But it's possible she hasn't seen the latest breed of LLMs. Yeah.
One more question.
Very impressed by your tracking abilities for Greenland. Did you get a chance to ask her what she thought about Zcash?
I did not. She is quite... I think we both share the opinion that cryptocurrency is worse than what we have. But we're clearly talking about kind of public blockchains, right? So we do share that opinion. Sorry, I need to shut this down. So yeah. I did not get to the point of telling her about kind of the wonders of cryptography and, and Zcash, but I think if we conceptualize it as private kind of digital cash, I think that would be within her acceptable worldview. Yeah. Do the women in the audience have any responses to this?
I had a question on that topic. So I think one point I got out of your talk was like how women tend to be sort of like at the receiving end of surveillance and oppression, and how financial oppression is like a major tool to suppress like an entire population, along with other things like sexuality and coerced sexuality, as you said. But I guess, yeah, from like the Zcash community, how well do you think we're doing in sort of like, on the other coin, like what can we do to make sure that people who are the first to be oppressed are like safe within this community, and how do we make sure that...
Sorry, slow down, say it again.
How do we make sure like within Zcash that we're providing the means for like an alternative, better future for like women especially?
Yeah, so everybody's surveilled, but women in particular are easier to suppress. I think one of the things that worry me about crypto, Zcash or not, is that most of the people using, well, these tools of financial freedom are not women, right? So I do share that worry. I'm not sure how we can get women more interested, but perhaps it's better contrasting the idea that, hey, if you feel like there are certain parts of your life where you don't feel free, here's a tool you can use, and make it as user-friendly as possible. Because at current moment, I mean, just, take a look around at the room. I think it's a better balance than at some conferences, but it's certainly not a tool that's, I think, sufficiently being used by a population who would benefit so much from being aware. Yeah.
I had an add-on question. So I was recently at a dinner with like 5 women where none of them knew anything about crypto, and so I was like, well, let's do this thing. And so in an attempt to explain it to them and kind of to what you're saying, to try to like suggest that there is a benefit to privacy at all, even just let alone financial privacy, there was such a huge pushback because I think, at least my takeaway was that women are perhaps more indoctrinated in the concept of like I have nothing to hide issue, right? So I was curious, like in your experience with, I'm sure the many people that you talk to all the time, like have you found that when you speak with women, there's a particular kind of way of combating that ideology that resonates with them?
I think you're always going to have some women who are more like, hey, here's a problem, I'm going to solve it now. Here's a tool I'm going to use. And then you're going to have other women who, are not like that. And I think my answer is not really an answer to what to say to other women, but more, in the Me Too movement, right? There's also the concept of how do we enroll men to help women out too, right? And I think that's a very strong and energetic population. So I'm not saying, or rather what I'm saying is, for men who feel inspired to make it easier for the women in their lives that they love and they know, I think there's a way for you to make things easier and more compelling to the women around you. So, endow them with the tools with which to protect themselves, especially for a time when you may not be there. Yeah.
So you mentioned history, and I found that really interesting. I guess in terms of like paying respect or thinking about history, because you see this, for example, in China with the Cultural Revolution that sort of rewrote history and that sort of disappeared. And in your case, even though you were born in the 80s, you went back 100 years prior and sort of studied history. And I think that's something that's often missing in the cryptocurrency space, and also perhaps as an attitude among the TikTok generation. So I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are, or Margaret Atwood's thoughts are, in terms of paying attention to sort of history and looking back, if you have any thoughts around that.
Yes. She's a student of history. She is also apparently one writer in a family of biologists. That's how so long ago she was exposed to the idea of low fertility and the environmental effects of what was happening then. So, for example, in 1985, sperm motility in the U.S. was already coming down. I know this today, but I didn't realize, So I think, yeah, she is a very serious student of history. It's important. I think for us too, so my final message, fight normalization, calls to that as well, right? Like, we need to remember how certain things were so that we can fight the idea that this is normal. There are a lot of things we accept today that are normal, but actually it's not ideal. At East Denver this year, I organized a series of privacy events, and the first talk we had was titled, "We Almost Didn't Get Encryption." And so we had some 90s cypherpunks on stage. I think one of them is in the audience today. And the goal there was to remind people that if the cypherpunks didn't fight in the 90s, we may have some really shitty encryption algorithms that are basically a joke today, right? So we kind of always need to remind people of how things were, yeah. And I think all of us in the room have this responsibility, right? We can't just sit here, I love privacy, freedom, whatever, but you need to remind people we can't take it for granted.
So another question, the vision of Gilead is pretty similar to me, at least, to Orwell's 1984 book and the vision of the state, where everything is super controlled, surveillance-based, and all that stuff. There's also a different vision of that by Huxley in A Happy World book, where basically the society is kind of slipped over or basically abducted by continuous bombarding of ads and things that give them like so little time of excitement, and later it disappears and they found lost. This kind of similar also to the TikTok generation thing that you mentioned, yes, where you get some amount of dopamine released really quickly, but then it's like completely unproductive and doesn't really bring you anything valuable at all. So I was wondering, what's your take on whether maybe we're not going towards Gilead, or maybe at least to a mix of these together with some other kinds of states or societies that are forming, where people is so bombarded with ads and stupid things to chase for, like cars, phones, whatever it is, that it's not going against them directly, but in reality, if you let enough time go, it will turn against them finally. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Like, we have bajillions of dollars being spent towards hitting our dopamine receptors. So, and I think in addition, the world is also bifurcating, right, into people with such different ideas about how to run the world. And this was something I was going to have in my presentation, but the idea that there are a lot of people who, just for a sense of belonging, they want to be part of, some violent group or, 4chan, etc. I think part of that stupidification also turns people towards doing things that are entirely not rational, not intellectual. So I think there are double dangers in this kind of commercial trend that we're seeing, commercial drivers that we're seeing.